If you're an investor in a coal plant in China in 2025, like, what are you thinking? Clearly, a bunch of entities are thinking it's a good idea. They probably don't anticipate having to go like head to head against renewables. They're not going to win anyway against nuclear or renewables or anything else that's getting built out there. They're anticipating fighting the other coal that's already in the system. It's the old like I don't have to run faster than the bear. I just have to run faster than you. So take that, but for coal plants.
A warm welcome back to Decouple. And welcome back, David Fishman, Senior Manager at the Lantau Group, and really back by popular demand. We had an excellent episode. I believe we just released it 3 weeks ago, but the people are hungry. They want more. And we didn't quite get to finish the whole story. So, David, thanks for coming back.
Yeah. Oh, thanks for having me again. And I'll try to keep my answers a little bit shorter this time, and hopefully we can actually get through more of the content.
No, I think the subject was just kind of overwhelming in nature, so there's no problem there having a part two. So listen, in our last episode, I think I dumbed it down a little bit on a tweet that I put out that got the views. Sometimes you have to do that, to work the algorithm. But I'll take a shot at sort of summarizing episode 1 and laying the framework for episode 2. But I think basically we were talking about China's emergence as an electrostate. I kind of just found that term, I think, from a Noah Smith essay recently, but I really like that term, with an economy that's approaching, world-class levels of electrification. We talked about electrification, I think, in terms of at first just numbers of households being electrified, and China's done quite well there. But in terms of, I think, total energy consumption, final energy consumption, China's up at about 30% now, having risen, I think, about 10%. So anyway, we're seeing this, fairly phenomenal rise in the use of electricity across sectors. And we looked at the reasons why. And my thesis, perhaps simplistic as it was that this was, largely driven by geopolitical constraints, reliance on oil and gas imports, and some peculiar maritime geography that makes China somewhat vulnerable to having those imports, those taps squeezed off. We also talked about whether we want to call it Chinese state capitalism or Chinese socialism with Chinese characteristics, the ways in which that has interacted with this development of alt energy, wind, solar, batteries, the whole gambit, EVs, and how China has been able to scale up those industries, which are very dependent, I think, on innovation, both in terms of developing the technology, the manufacturing at scale, and also when we talk about nuclear, the construction of small total numbers of highly complex projects. So I think innovation happening at a number of levels there, and we talked a bit about how, again, state capitalism or state socialism, whatever you want to call it, is facilitating that. So as we mentioned just now in the introduction, we got through a lot of content. I think we touched on wind and solar, rooftop solar, EVs, nuclear. I won't say exhaustively because there's so much to go through there, but we didn't quite get to the battery revolution. We didn't talk about that monster hydro dam being planned for Tibet. And last of all, we didn't talk all that much about coal, which is still, as I understand it, the dominant source of power generation for electricity in China. So that's what I remember. David, I don't know if you have any other reflections or wanted to comment on that Twitter thread that went pretty viral. The floor is yours.
Yeah, 3 words. Straits of Malacca, right? You hammered the virality with that one. But yeah, I had a bit of fun with it. It is, of course, a bit more complex. And, in true modern day kind of nerd fashion, I decided to ask an LLM what it thought about that statement. And it gave me a bunch of answers, right? It's like, yeah, energy security is in there, but lots of stuff is in there. It's a state priority, right? It was a bit of fun. It's a bit of back and forth. And, I think it's reasonable to include it, certainly, in the list of priorities. But I mean, it's a complex world out there. There's a lot of stuff that drive decisions like this.
For sure. But what drives virality is 3-word statements. Anyway, so let's dive in again. Just in terms of this terminology of an electrostate, I was just in preparation for part 2 here, looking at again that total final consumption as electricity across a few jurisdictions. And looking in my backyard, in Ontario and in Quebec, it seems like places that have a lot of hydroelectricity for obvious reasons have pretty electrified economies. Quebec's up there what do I have here? 41%. And that makes sense because they heat with hydro, that frigid water up in James Bay, transmitted on, these are not long, HVDC lines. I think they're high voltage AC lines, but they're bringing that frigid, cold flowing water power down to cities like Montreal and keeping them warm in the winter. So, China's not, leading the world in that regard, but for a country that's not swimming in hydroelectricity, I think it's very much world leading. So I don't know where you want to jump in, David. As I said, I think the key topics I wanted to get at today were touching on some of the sectors we didn't, in our last episode, didn't have time for. So hydroelectricity, coal. I am really interested in what's going on with batteries in China. But I'm going to leave it up to you, man, to decide which appetizer or main course to start with.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we can talk about hydro. Hydro is very interesting because, well, first off, I mean, we would love to have some of your hydro in the U.S. So we've tried repeatedly to get some of your hydro, actually, and the voters of the great state of Maine, which is my home state, keep voting it down. So we're not going to get any Quebec hydro. Although I don't know if it was actually supposed to be delivered to Maine. It was going to end up in the NEISO. But certainly those lines are not going to cross any Maine wilderness anytime soon. Because there's nothing we like better than sticking it to big corporations and people in big cities. And as far as I could tell, that deal benefited both peoples in big cities and big corporations. And Mainers aren't going to have any of that. But in terms of hydro in China, which is what I'm supposed to talk about, yeah, I mean, traditionally it's always been the renewable energy source, the clean energy source for China. And even before, Three Gorges Dam, of course, is massive still. It was a massive news story when it was constructed. But even before that, hydro was a big deal in China for decades. It was the only clean source for a long time. And in the past, I sort of told people like, oh yeah, the future of renewables in China is definitely going to be, driven by wind and solar, because honestly, how many untapped rivers could there still be? And I said that kind of, common sense, right? Well, it turns out a lot, actually. There's still a lot of untapped hydro potential in China, a whole lot. And, the story that made the big news, it was about 2 months ago now, 3 months ago, is that, that Tibetan mega hydro project. But there's still also tons and tons of smaller projects, too, across the whole country. It's amazing how much hydro today they still have that they could potentially exploit.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just in terms of a reference for hydro in China, for me, often this is kind of a nuclear advocacy talking point, but when sort of trying to frame energy accidents, not just look at them under a microscope in isolation. I think an example that's often brought up it's blanking right now, but a dam collapse that occurred in China, I believe in the 70s or 80s.
No, it's horrific. When a Chinese dam collapses, people get swept away, but then also it inundates farmland. In the past, especially, it would mean like farmland was just put underwater for years and years, and then people can't get enough food, and then malaria from the mosquitoes. It was just you'd see this all throughout Chinese history. Every few years, it would be like so and so, some dike in some province collapses, 250,000 people die, and you're like how are those numbers possible? Yeah, no. So hydro has been historically, the Chinese civilization has been built and as one of the major functional victories of the emperor, of the leadership, was being able to tame the rivers and being able to actually bend water to your will and just stop flooding and killing people every couple decades.
Forgive the tangent here, but I got to bring this up. There's a great book by Charles Mann. He has a book called 1491 and 1493. Why does this have anything to do with China, since these have to do with the Americas pre and post contact in the Columbian Exchange? Well, apparently tubers like potatoes made their way to China as part of that Columbian Exchange, of the kind of recreation of Pangea through a global integrated economy. And whereas the Inca planted those potatoes in carefully terraced, rock constrained terraces in the mountains, there was a bit of a crash program apparently to plant the potatoes in what had been pretty marginal land for growing crops in mountains, and I guess the terracing wasn't quite done right, and massive erosion, and apparently this led to huge floods and silt flows, and some would argue in this sort of geographic determinism, which I love so much, as has become clear in our last episode, resulted in some serious economic challenges and development challenges in China. So anyway, had to bring in that little tangent. But taming the waters has been a challenge. And Three Gorges, I remember hearing it has it's holding back so much water that there's a tiny impact on the wobble and rotation of the Earth. There's probably a microsecond longer day
Something
as a
something like
result.
that. Yeah, I've heard that. I don't know if it's if it's one of those urban rumors or urban myths or if it's a real thing, but it's plausible, I guess.
So anything else you got for us on this Tibet dam? I understand it's going to be something like 3 times larger than the Three Gorges.
No, it's absolutely massive, and anything that makes a 16 gigawatt facility look small has to be just monumental, right? I mean, it's not the low hanging fruit when it comes to hydropower development, right? The low hanging fruit, quote unquote easy dams were built decades ago, I'm sure. And it's in very remote territory. It's very far from population centers. You're going to have to work at it for, I don't know, maybe a decade, 2 decades, something like that, and a huge high voltage network to carry it to where it's actually needed. And then you've got people screaming downstream about the impact on irrigation. You've got, I think, Chinese neighbors concerned about the impact it will have on the watersheds in the downstream sectors as well. I think downstream in India, they might even dam it already. And so they're quite concerned about the upstream dam affecting the downstream dam. It's obviously a very geopolitically fraught topic. And as has been the dams in southwest China, like around Yunnan as well, because those same waters flow into the Mekong and flow through Vietnam. So anytime China is trying to do something with water in its southwest, it's not just a China issue; it's a geopolitical issue for the whole region and for its neighbors. But if we just look at the development of the dam itself and what it's going to be, it's massive, right? That you could be hoping to offset so much. It will be coal, right? It will be offsetting coal in southwest China with hydro coming in from Tibet. That would be, a huge game changer in terms of, we're talking about, the renewables are nice. They're stemming the flow. The wind and solar stemming the growth of coal. Now, 45 gigawatts of hydropower actually chips away a lot, more than chips away. It takes out a big chunk of coal generation. So that's a very big deal.
My understanding is it's a little bit more of a run-of-river operation than the Three Gorges, and so often you get a little bit less of a capacity to, say, balance renewables with that. Is that what you're hearing as well, or?
Yeah. I was asked this question before, and I went looking for the answer because I thought it would be easy to find. It wasn't. It wasn't stated like these. Well, it's a series of dams, or a series of maybe not dams, but generation projects. And so it's not like all one, massive Hoover Dam, but a series of them. But it looks like it's a series of run-of-river, and that it has already, some hydropower has already been installed farther down the river somewhere, and it was also using the run-of-river rather than a reservoir style. I believe the river flows through, like the bottom of two mountains, and it's like a river gorge mostly, and so I don't even know how they could contain it anyway. But I think that's the approach.
That's interesting because I think a lot of people are conceiving it as just this, monolithic single mega dam. And, I think often we hear, hydro's been around for a while and you go after the best resources first, and that maybe this was just, on such an engineering scale that it was not even thought possible.
Yeah, that's what I think.
It's kind of a mix of kind of all of the above there. So just again, to sort of fit that into the overall power generation package in China, you mentioned hydro's significant. Where does it fit in terms of a percentage, say, compared to, I think coal's still dominant, like 50-60%, right?
Yeah, hydro is, I think it was 16% of the generation mix last year. And in China scale, right, that's like, I don't know, several good-sized countries of electricity. Large countries of electricity. So 15 is nothing to sneeze at, but of course, coal is still, what is it, 56%, something like that last year.
And I mean, in Canada, because, our hydroelectric dams are base, we've got 2 new ones that have come on or are coming on sort of this decade. But it feels like a really dormant industry in terms of the construction of these projects. And, once operational, they're not big job creators or anything like that. Like, is there like a booming hydroelectricity industry? Does that sort of feed expertise into other mega project industries like nuclear, or what's your sense?
I don't want to be ignorant and say that it doesn't because I'm sure power engineering and turbine engineering, that some skills transfer somehow, but it does seem like a little bit of an island to itself, compared to other types of technology and where the electricity trends are going. You get what you can out of it, but I don't know if that's going to be impacting the rest of the industry that much.
Yeah, I mean, I often make the comparison when I'm talking to policymakers, and nuclear energy is very prone to category errors. When trying to compare it to other familiar power generation sources like gas turbines and things like that. So I always find that hydroelectricity is a relatively good comparator. Obviously, it's not perfect, but massive capital-intensive project where the cost of capital is really important, where you can have these blowouts in terms of interest during construction that can sort of kill the economics. But in the end, you end up with essentially a century asset and pretty cheap power generation. Now, that's, again, possible in an environment where I think the state often takes a leading role in terms of financing in a scenario in which, financialized capital looking for a 5-year return on investment are not going to be pleased. I mean, that might be another reason why we're seeing less hydroelectric development potentially in the West, other than maybe having already got the best spots. But being financed, I guess, in similar ways to nuclear, or what's the deal?
I mean, I'm just thinking like Canada. I know something like 89% of your country is just tundra up there, right? But there's got to be some flowing waters up there, right? If you did a China, and instead of putting all your stuff far away in the Gobi Desert, instead you start tapping and exploiting some of those rivers that are flowing through Nunavut or something, and bringing the power back down to the very narrow band of Canada that's inhabited. Like, could that make sense? I don't know. Maybe it's just such a unreasonable thing to do when you've got nuclear and closer hydro that makes more sense. But my mind can't help but imagine, like, what if?
All right, well, let's move from weird musings and hypotheticals and Columbian exchange discussion about hydro to something maybe more tangible. Coal. There was a report out recently looking at the amount of coal that's been added to the grid. I think it's something like reaching 2015 levels. The narrative is, renewables are pushing coal off the system. Tell us what's really going on.
Yeah, a ton of coal was added in 2024, and yeah, it was. I think the number was, in fact, that not this much coal hasn't been added since 2015. So tons and tons of new coal capacity being added on. And every time you add a coal plant, like, look, it competes in a merchant market, so it's got to compete for dispatch. It's not like it's getting guaranteed dispatch, right? But you've got to imagine that if you're an investor in a coal plant in China in 2025, like, what are you thinking exactly? And I've been musing about this because there clearly a bunch of entities are thinking it's a good idea. And the way I've been musing about it, I guess, is they probably don't anticipate having to go like head to head against renewables. They're not going to win anyway against nuclear or renewables or anything else that's getting built out there. They're just they're anticipating fighting the other coal that's already in the system, right? So, it's the old, like, I don't have to run faster than the bear. I just have to run faster than you. So take that, but for coal plants, right? Like, all I have to do is outperform the older, like, subcritical fleet that was built 15, 20 years ago, and I am still going to win dispatch for my new asset, and I'm going to be load following, and I built from the start expecting to operate flexibly, and so I put the right, investment upgrades and retrofits in from the start, so I'm ready to operate the way the new energy system needs me to operate. So that report also mentioned, it was out of it was the CREA report, right? They said something like 75% of the new capacity is financed by coal miners. Like, yeah, that kind of makes sense, right? You're trying to ensure you have a future business for your product yourself, right? You build a coal plant and sell coal to yourself. And I got to imagine that's the only people that would be crazy enough to want to build that right now. They're saying, hey, in 2035, my plant's still going to make money, and your plant is going to be forced out because you don't have access to the coal that I do, because I own the coal. I think that's kind of the logic, or at least that's my theory about how it's going down. And then, yeah, is the generation actually going to go down? Is coal generation going to decline even with all this new capacity getting built, right? Is it just going to sit there, not getting used? I think that's a real concern for a lot of people. Like, if you have it, wouldn't you use it? It's like, well, if it costs more than everything else, then maybe not. I think we saw a little bit of the proof of that fear coming true in the last few months of 2024, and so that's why it was a relevant concern. It really looked like in November and December, what should have been great months for renewables, and they should have performed well, they should have covered all the power consumption growth, and instead they didn't really deliver, and coal generation went up instead, which is a really surprising thing to see if you were following the sector. Like, how did that happen? China's building so many renewables. The capacity figures were crazy. It wasn't especially cloudy. It wasn't especially still, not windy in November and December. Like, what happened? And I had a theory, and I think the report had a similar idea. It was, if you're contracting for power in China's partially liberalized, partially marketized power regime, you sign an annual power contract. You don't sell that much power through real-time markets in China. It's all back in December 2023, the grid company is saying, all right, I got to buy power to supply the power customers. Like, let me go out, sign some annual power supply contracts. So they contract for a bunch of power, coal power, right? And then throughout the year, they're still buying all the renewables that connect to the grid, because that's also a policy mandate. They got to buy the renewables, and they're contracted to buy coal power. You arrive at the end of the year, Chinese power demand growth is pretty lousy in the last quarter of the year. It came in way under expectations. And all of a sudden, I think they were overcontracted. I think they were like 125% supplied on power in November. And so now you're the grid company in China, and you're partially liberalized, partially state-managed market, and you're like, what do I do? Oh, I'm going to violate some contracts. I'm going to break some contracts. I'm just going to tell whoever's cheaper. Who is it cheaper to break the contract with? Renewable generators, sorry, I'll make you whole next year, or I'll just pay the penalties, whatever it is. And that kind of thing will keep happening when you have a hybrid market where you've got real-time markets that are economically driven, but you also have long-term markets that are trying to cushion the impact of fuel price volatility. And China's very much in this transitionary state right now. So that's a little bit of my take on what happened with coal in the last year, and especially some of the conclusions from that report.
Okay, a ton of threads to tug on there. So you're saying it's sort of like coal worker pension funds that are funding these new stations?
Yeah, I mean, potentially, or just a big state coal miner, right? And they're saying, I'm going to be squeezed like heck in the coming years because I'm going to be trying to sell coal to coal-fired generators who are trying to stay alive. And so,
And less competitive because they're subcritical.
and they're fighting against cheap renewables and cheap everything. And so I'm going to get squeezed too. Now, what if I have my own coal power plant? I'll just sell coal to myself. I'll generate myself. I'll build a brand new ultra supercritical plant, and I'll shoulder everybody else out of the market. I imagine that's the logic.
And where does coal sit in that dispatch order in terms of the partially liberalized market?
If it were fully liberalized, right, and you're looking at pure economic merit order, it would be, it would do all right, I guess. Obviously, all the renewables, all the hydro comes first, nuclear would come first too, and then you got your 600 and your 1,000 megawatt coal plants. Most of the time, I think it would clear somewhere around a 600 megawatt coal plant. So 10,000, the gigawatt level clears first, and then probably 600 or so you'd fill up. And then during peaks, there's a gas fleet too. There's a small gas fleet. So during peak hours, gas would also dispatch, but most of the time, only maybe half the coal would actually get dispatched.
And so how do you get your head around just the numbers of these additions? I think 90 some odd gigawatts of coal started construction in 2024. More permitted. Can you give us a sense of those numbers? And then how, again, you live in China. Francois Morin, a good friend of mine, has been on a couple of times talking about Chinese nuclear. He's like, try and picture China as a number of, almost like the European Union, a number of states within a state, just in terms of the population, the power systems, et cetera. So how do you make sense or communicate a number like they're adding 90 or starting construction on 90 gigawatts of coal capacity in 2024? How do you help a humble Canadian understand that when that's maybe more than our entire power generation in the whole bloody country?
Yeah, and that's a very apt metaphor where you say China's not a country, it's 33 country-sized provinces. That it's actually larger than the EU, right? 3 times larger than the EU. It's 33 or 30 something Germanys, basically large EU countries. You've got a handful of smaller ones, but most of them are 60, 70, 80, 90 million people and the accompanying power consumption. When it comes to the 90 gigawatts of coal, though, it wasn't 90 gigawatts everywhere. It was really concentrated in a couple of, like, especially rogue provinces that are building almost all of the new coal. And, you'll get like a couple units here and there, and it's like 30 gigawatts in Inner Mongolia. Like, come on, guys, like another 27 gigawatts in Guangdong. What are you doing? What are you up to? You're screwing us. But yeah, Inner Mongolia, they're co-building a lot of the coal plants with the renewables, right? We know the renewables can't survive on their own, so they're going to be co-located with something. In the U.S., the answer is gas. In China, the answer is new flexible coal. So a lot of the coal is being paired with those renewables for load following purposes. It's never going to be as flexible as gas, but China doesn't have that much gas. So that's what's going on. And then in terms of scale, yeah, like, I don't know, 30 gigawatts, that's an entire country's coal fleet in many cases. And that's just you can go on the like GEM database, Global Energy Monitor database, and you can click into the map and you can see, it'll say, like, it's this industrial facility that is building 2 new coal plants. And then it's, the next city over, which also has 5 million people, is building 2 new coal plants. And then the next city up the road, which has 3 million people, is building another 2 coal plants. Like, it makes sense when you break it down like that. When you say a city of X size has a demand of this much, and so they need their power from somewhere, and you distribute that to, what is it, like 100, slightly over 100 cities in China have at least 1 million people. When you spread it out like that, then, oh yeah, okay, that's why they think they need that.
This is something that I only am kind of embarrassingly came to realization of recently, but we talk a lot about capacity factors of power generation sources, but I also recently came to think about capacity factors of transmission infrastructure. And so we're talking about these massive HVDC lines. I'm not sure if they're coming from places like Inner Mongolia. My Chinese geography is a little hazy, but it sounds like maybe co-locating coal plants near these sources of intermittent generation mean that you get a higher capacity factor, a higher bang for your investment buck on some of that high voltage, long distance transmission. Does that jive? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That's 100% true. You can look at some of the provinces release specific data on what actually flowed through the high voltage line in the last year or something like that. And they're only, even the ones that are explicitly going to a wind base or a solar base are only maybe 40, 50, 60% renewables, and the other half will be coal. The only ones that are mostly clean most of the time are the ones that carry hydropower. So these high voltage lines, if they only operated whenever the renewables were available to operate, they'd never get their money back on the line, right? They're only using it half the time.
Remind me again, in terms of like per capita electricity consumption. I'm just trying to get a sense. I think you said power demand sort of plateaued towards like Q4 of 2024. Obviously, there's a lot of demand coming on with AI, with other industrial loads. But just in general, folks in China, like, how much power are they using compared to Europeans, Canadians, Americans? And how much growth is there just to add, again, as my French historian guest said, more and more and more of kind of everything, just to meet this growing demand and deal with, Jevons paradox whenever we get some efficiency gains, like maybe DeepSeek.
Yeah, it's interesting. So yeah, industrial power consumption was pretty weak through the end of the year, but services and residential consumed like crazy, actually. They're still growing really rapidly. So overall on the year, Chinese power consumption was up, I don't know, like 6.8%, I think it was. And even all of that means Chinese per capita electricity consumption has just reached developed European country levels. Actually, we'll say Germany. Germany is a little bit high for Europe, but it's right around Germany. It's right around Japan in terms of per capita electricity consumption. Those two countries have been coming down on their per capita consumption, and China's been rising. And I think they just crisscrossed those two specific countries, I think last year maybe. But then we talk about the real baddies. United States, Canada, Australia are the most electricity, the most energy hungry countries in the world, and their per capita consumption is double that Germany, Japan, China level right now, and it's come down, I think, a little bit, like maybe flattened off just a little bit, but it's still really high.
And that's wild because we're not really even electrified in terms of heating or transportation or other, big loads that we might anticipate are coming on. We're just
I don't
big
know what you
houses, I
guys are
guess.
doing
And
up there to use so much electricity per capita.
yeah, yeah. There's some stat about, I think 2 billion people in the world use less electricity than a, North American fridge, but it is a hog of a fridge. I guess just tying in one other maybe slight tangent here. In terms of this question about power demand plateauing, I was listening to this economist from the London School of Economics. I think her name's Ku Jin, Professor Ku Jin, and she was saying basically like China has had uninterrupted growth cycle for 40 years. Like this most recent sort of economic turbulence and volatility is really sort of the first bust cycle, coincides a bit with COVID. That's kind of what's really extraordinary. Not that, we've reached peak China and China is sort of collapsing, but just that it's having an economic correction as the West has periodically every decade or so. How do you sort of see that in terms of power markets?
It's funny, I just actually picked up her book. It arrived yesterday. I haven't started reading it yet, but I'm quite looking forward to it. It's Beyond Socialism and Capitalism, something like that. I think that's, yeah, you just picked it up. But, and yeah, so number one, I agree. Obviously, the sentiment of, this is the first, and I didn't even know if it's a bust, it's a hiccup, right? And the Chinese version of a bust means you're still putting up crazy numbers. You're still dominating the EV market. You're still dominating renewable energy in general. It just means real estate is pretty lousy and a couple other sectors too. So if this is the Chinese version of a bust, like maybe there are worse things. But yeah, I think it's fair to take a higher view where you say, if you just, characterize it as a correction, where you said Chinese people enjoyed such unfettered growth for such a long time that anything that isn't amazing growth all the time feels lousy. I used the example before. It's like, 10 years ago, it didn't even matter what you studied in school. It didn't matter what you studied in college. No matter what you studied, the sector you went into was growing like crazy, and you were going to find a great job, and it was going to be a good job for a long time, and your salary was going to keep going up. And now you have to be picky for the first time in like modern Chinese history. Like, oh, don't study civil engineering. You're going to be screwed if you studied civil engineering. There's no, construction projects. Don't study these certain few sectors. Go study hard tech. Go study mechanical engineering. Go study, energy systems design or something like that. You're still in the money. But now you got to be a little bit picky, which hadn't happened for 40 years. I get that. But yeah, overall, I'm more inclined to call it a correction away from what was an unhealthy over-reliance on real estate, and hopefully into something new and better. And clearly clean energy is a big part of that.
All right, well, let's shift bases a little bit towards this idea kind of an innovation economy. I think this will fit nicely into covering batteries, which we didn't get a chance to cover last couple weeks ago. I've brought up this example a few times when thinking about innovation in centrally planned economies. Obviously, Soviet Union was sort of a real textbook case. I don't know. I'm not a fluent economist, but I think it's close as it gets to pretty rigid, centralized state planning. And you still had innovation. I mean, they kind of led the space race briefly with Sputnik. I mean, you could argue that it was because they just kidnapped a whole bunch of Nazi rocket scientists, but in any case, I mean, there was, I think, impressive competition from a country that was otherwise, economically a shadow of the other great global superpower. And I think there's a few other sectors that you could argue within the Soviet economy that occurred in military and nuclear energy, nuclear weapons, et cetera. There's a famous example of the Ural motorcycle, which I just love. I think in 1939, they were identifying this as a kind of way to transport troops and things like that. And so they reverse engineered a BMW, motorbike, and in typical sort of Soviet fashion, just prioritize like the Kalashnikov, something that, can get dust on it, get dirty, and be easily repaired. And that motorcycle continued in production. Actually, it's still in production today, but certainly up until the collapse of the Soviet system, large numbers of units with basically very little change, very little innovation. And it's sort of held up as a bit of a textbook example of kind of what centrally planned economies are good at, just sort of banging out large volume serial units of non-innovative tech. And I think, my sort of preconceptions about China up until recently are essentially, okay, China acquires either nefariously or through, some tough negotiation around technology transfer, technologies innovated elsewhere, and then, mass produces them. So I guess I'm trying to get a sense of like, are we in a different moment? It is a rhetorical question because I think I'm identifying my thought here as being stale, but run with that a little bit. Give me a sense, and maybe if we want to tie that to something material, we could tie it into batteries.
Yeah, sure. I'll try. So, I mean, I guess I would say first off, it's it actually takes innovation to get really good at copying stuff. Like maybe that's just to be able to churn it out and then consistently get 1% better at it and 1% better at it. And I would say maybe that's something that China, even already before the recent awareness that people have had, was already really good at doing, was already good at taking the thing that maybe had been innovated somewhere else and then improving it constantly with efficiency and shaving off more and more bits of non-optimized whatever until that thing was incredibly, perfectly cost-effective and perfectly well-designed. And that's, I think, a feature of the competition. So even before you had this newly emergent innovation economy, you still had innovation in production. And I think for a long time, if you were into, and that was kind of like what was up with Japan, right? Back in the 80s too. They were saying like, what we really like is that the way they make stuff. It's Six Sigma, it's lean, it's the Toyota way, right? They're so good. They're innovating in how they produce. I think for a while that was also how you'd characterize China's innovation. They had a bit of things here and there, but it was the real, breakthroughs were maybe in how they were doing it. And then in the last few years, yeah, the breakthroughs appear to be fundamental breakthroughs now instead of in production technology or production methods. It's, the Chinese Academy of Science has just found the newest way to slice bread. And actually it's not bread anymore. And also we're not using a knife anymore. It's something entirely different, like really that kind of breakthroughs. Something like where we say we found a way to make sodium ion batteries work, or we're actually like, we have a production solid state battery now. 5G is not a dream. We're actually just building them. We're just doing them now. That it was now the innovation, the patent came here, the application from patent to prototype and from prototype to production was all just kind of homegrown. That's the last couple years. And batteries is a great example of where that happens or where you can see it. I mean, why batteries and why China? Certainly it makes sense that the batteries initially were going into all the consumer electronics that were being made and being shipped out. Right? And China was dominating the production of the consumer electronics, so they had a huge demand for batteries and then competition for batteries and then innovations for batteries. I don't know if I necessarily see how that gets you from BYD, the best battery manufacturer, to BYD, the incredibly cool, innovative EV manufacturer. I don't know if I'm sophisticated to trace the connection between those two things, but certainly there has been that shift.
Yeah, there was another great anecdote and story. Premier Li Ka-chung, I think in 2015, went overseas to sign a trade document, and in so doing, with this beautiful Western ballpoint pen, came to this realization that we don't make anything like this in China. They're just really scratchy and shitty back home. And apparently it was this moment of, I'm not sure if it was national shame or just sort of national motivation to kind of, get better at precision manufacturing. Is that something that's changed? Like, I'm thinking, in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war, Russia, for instance, dependent on a lot of, precision machining tools from Germany. And in our sort of, multipolar world, trade war based world, there's been some talk about countries like Russia and potentially China, getting stagnant because of being cut off from, precision manufacturing. Maybe we could talk about chips in that regard as well. But do you think China's kind of getting past that point where sort of sanctions on things like chips, for instance, are going to be less impactful because it's got whatever it is, a critical mass of researchers, of scientists, of state support, of institutes to carry it forward at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I don't dare to. There's a lot of people who know an awful lot about chips, and I feel like if I say anything, I'm going to say the wrong thing, and somebody's going to tell me that I'm stupid. But it does seem like the gap has narrowed. That it was a 10-year gap between whatever China can do and what the cutting edge is, and then it was a 5-year gap, and then it's a 2.5-year gap, and maybe now it's, I don't know, like a 1-year gap or something, that it keeps narrowing like that. And that's clearly, like when you keep looking over your shoulder and the guy who's coming up behind you seems closer and closer every time you look, you got to figure they're doing something differently from what you're doing at the time or doing right now. But yeah, what was made in China 2025, right? It got quiet because it wasn't received so well once it got really well known. But made in China 2025 was like a laundry list of all the sectors that Li Keqiang was feeling bad about, maybe. Right? It's like all these things that, if we want to become a modern technological innovation production powerhouse, it means we should be good at making those things and not good at making RC cars and Barbie dolls. Let Cambodia and Bangladesh make those because we want to be in the business of making rockets.
Let's talk about the price drops that we're seeing in battery production in China. It seems like it's closely mirroring or maybe slightly behind price drops in solar module production. This has major repercussions. 3 or 4 years ago, I would scoff at the idea that there could be significant not voltage modulation services, but actual storage enough to kick large amounts of gas off the grid in places like California, for instance. And now batteries are really costing down. Can you tell us a little bit about that story of how that became possible and whether that's a sort of unique to China story in terms of the ingredients of state capitalism or Chinese socialism with socialism with Chinese characteristics that sort of enabled these cost downs and the scaling up of production?
I mean, to me, it looks a lot like the other sectors, right? Like your solar and your wind turbines, right? That you've got a mature technology that works pretty well, but everybody's doing it. Everybody can make it already. And the only way you could get an advantage is what? Like do it a little bit bigger so that you have more economies of scale and you can beat out the other guys a little bit. Or you throw a huge R&D budget at it so that it can get 1% more efficient each year or 1% cheaper or 1% whatever it is. But the other guy has the same idea too. And so everybody's throwing 40% R&D budget at it until they all just, some die, some run out of money, and some find that 1% extra cool thing and it gets a little bit better, and then they put an extra bell and whistle on it. And then once it's cheaper, you find all kinds of new applications for it. Places that you never thought would be a market for the battery or never thought would be a market for the solar panel. Today I saw, you've heard, China has those shared bikes like on the streets everywhere, right? I think just recently I realized that there's a solar panel on them in the bike basket. There's a solar panel embedded in the bike basket that powers the bike's like GPS and maybe it's bike lock or something like that. So if it's ever too far away from where it's supposed to be or something, the bike locks. I was looking and I was like, how have I never noticed there's a solar panel there? And why is there a solar panel? Well, it's got to be because they're so cheap. You can put it there. You can afford to put it there. You can create this new bike share product that has a solar panel. And that's going to be what's happening with batteries too, right? They compete and they innovate 1% here and there and they get a little bit better and then they keep finding new places to put them because now they're more attractive. And so I imagine the batteries are following the same trajectory as the other ones. Does that make sense to you, I guess?
For sure. I mean, for sure it does. For sure it does. I guess another, outsider, misconception I probably have is, that these are just big state monolithic companies, or, a couple have been chosen and picked. But it does sound like there's really, really, as you mentioned in the solar sector, like vigorous competition amongst these actors, which is also, driving down costs in addition to supply chain dominance and, critical mineral processing and things like that.
As I'm thinking about it, what's really notable is the companies that build the solar farms and the wind farms, right? The really capital intensive activities in that regard are usually state owned, but a lot of the equipment manufacturers are private. All the big solar panel manufacturers, the big wind turbine manufacturers, the battery makers, they're all private sector. Now, of course, they're also capital intensive to set up the factory. And they have state support in some way. They might have preferential loans and land grants, so they get use of the land to build their factory relatively cheap. But they're all private enterprises, and it really seems like some type of bifurcation where it's like the technology innovation should be in the private sector, but then like deploying the capital heavy, long lead time, long return on investment type activities, the state can dominate those. That's kind of I'm thinking out loud right now because I've just kind of noticed that as we're talking about it, but it really seems like that's the organization I'm seeing across clean tech.
I love these little decouple insights that occur spontaneously. just to maybe close off batteries, we talked about coal, making those high voltage transmission lines, more economically viable, and these new plants providing, a load following capacity. There is talk, though, about just such an incredible surplus of solar production, for instance, at these mega farms, that it starts to make things like green hydrogen potentially viable for grid balancing. I think most listeners are familiar with, Michael Liebreich's hydrogen ladder, and sort of what tends to make sense is making green hydrogen for industrial parks to sort of replace existing uses for hydrogen and fertilizer and things like that. There's a lot of talk within sort of the clean tech community in the West, where there's a lot of, I think, rainbows and unicorns about how green hydrogen is going to, be a major source of power generation, and we should, have a Canadian-Germany hydrogen alliance, or, Australia will supply Japan with 30% of its, fuels for its power plants. Those all seem pretty laughable, but, I've learned that China can make strange things come true just through, state capitalism, brute forcing, etc. Is there talk about green hydrogen playing a grid balancing role, or is that still sort of a bit fantastical?
Green hydrogen for power is still not really being talked about. There's always demo projects, and they're always going to say, we're going to co-fire the gas plant with 20% green hydrogen. We'll see how it goes. And it works, yeah, but it's expensive. In the hydrogen ladder from Liebreich, right? Hydrogen to power is like the worst one, right? Or like one of the worst ones. It really doesn't make sense, along with small passenger vehicles. It's the green hydrogen in China. There is a huge push for it. It's going to be a big deal. It's going to be tons of solar churned into green hydrogen, like we talked about last time, but it's going to be for those other applications. The ones in the ladder that make sense, your ammonia and your methanol and your, applications like that, industrial hydrogen. It's really tough. We're power modelers. That's what we do, or a big part of what we do at the Lantau Group. And when we do long-term grid dispatch modeling, we have to build out a capacity mix out to 2050. Sometimes we get a customer who's like, well, what about hydrogen? Will there be any hydrogen in there? We're like, I can force it into the system, right? I have an economic dispatch model that only builds certain resources if it's the most economic option in that year. And if you don't force hydrogen into the model will never build hydrogen, at least not with the cost curves that we have projected right now.
And what about batteries? Like in California, for instance, we're seeing, some people say we're seeing the duck curve being slayed, or I don't know, the neck chopped off the duck curve. I think it has had an impact certainly on that gas ramp peak. Is the scale of Chinese power generation, does it lend itself to mass scale battery deployment, such that it can provide, again, not just sort of voltage regulation, but actual significant storage, and maybe shave some of that coal coal as peaker activity that we've discussed earlier in this podcast?
Definitely, absolutely. So it's actually just until last week or 10 days ago, batteries were mandated to be built with renewables. So if you wanted to build a wind or solar farm, you had to also prepare 10% of nameplate capacity for 2 hours in storage. You didn't usually have to build it yourself. You could rent from the battery facility down the street. You lease the capacity. But that was a mandate just until a week ago, or a week and a half ago. The new renewables offtake policy, in addition to changing the renewables on-grid tariffs, which was a big deal, also just abolished the storage requirement, which was strange. It was quite surprising to me. It explicitly said no province shall make storage a requirement for grid capacity, or for grid quota and grid connection quota or something. It was basically saying stop mandating storage. But the implication in there probably being, at least to my mind, was that let the market decide if it needs storage. We're trying to push all the renewable generators into the market, and they'll decide themselves if they need generation-side storage, if they want to try to time shift some of their generation from noon when power prices are negative to the evening peak when power prices are quite good. And that makes sense, right? When we do our long-term capacity modeling, the system builds a lot of batteries. When you get into high penetration rates for renewables and they're all cannibalizing each other's business at noon, the only way for it to make sense for them to build is to also build batteries and start shifting their generation around. So I expect we'll see a lot of batteries, and batteries in power will be a very big deal, along with pumped hydro and things like that. And they'll be competing for capacity markets. They'll fight against coal and gas in the capacity markets, and they'll also be able to access ancillary services markets, and they'll do some load following stuff. And I think batteries have a really, really solid future, at least with the technology layout that we have right now in China.
Yeah, I just got back from a visit to Chile, and I actually got to visit the world's largest open pit mine, which is Chuquicamata. 1 out of every 13 kilograms of copper ever produced ever in the world come from this mine. It was really extraordinary. And this is probably out of your wheelhouse. I probably need to talk to sort of a minerals geologist, but it does seem, it's kind of a natural question that comes to my mind that I should really get answered. But just, are there limits in terms of just the sheer volume from a minerals perspective that you can turn into batteries to provide those services at such a large scale as China may do? But again, probably a better question for a geologist, but it was remarkable. There's an expert that was saying we're going to need, to add 2 Chuquicamata size mines every year to sort of meet the copper demands of some of probably the most ambitious sort of renewable scaling, because, conventional power plant is fairly copper efficient compared to, wind and solar being sort of 7x or something. Anyway, those are kind of mineral constraints. I'm not sure if those come up at all in your modeling or in the discourse in China, but
no, we don't force hard cap. We would handle it by forcing like a hard cap to certain technologies to say there's no more copper, there's no more, I don't know, molybdenum or whatever to build any more of that. It would be quite tough to hard code into the model, but I think what you have to figure is that if it's a battery, let's say, it's not lithium's pretty abundant, but let's say it's lithium, right? And we decide that lithium is now the bottleneck. Like, wouldn't you assume then that the battery makers would find something else, would innovate us out of that? Is it now sodium ion that saves the day? It's a little too expensive now, but if supposed lithium were scarce, now sodium ion is the way to go. I don't think lithium necessarily would be the bottleneck, but that's the kind of my kind of expectation for how the market would handle it.
That's the famous Paul Ehrlich, Julian Simons bet about the price of a basket of commodities, whether they're going to go up when Ehrlich was saying the sky was falling. So interesting. Anything that we didn't touch on today? I think this has been pretty comprehensive. Looking forward to having you back, for breaking developments. But I think we've set a really nice foundation in terms of better understanding broadly the Chinese power sector and tangling some of these geopolitical and geographic deterministic and I guess sort of economic system enablers and constraints. But I'll give the mic to you for the last few minutes, Dave.
It's tough to see sometimes how all of the stuff that China is doing right now in clean tech could have been accomplished in pretty much any other country, or at least one that operates by a pretty strong profit mandate from the owners of capital, right? From your hedge funds and from your venture capitalists and your investment bankers, right? Because they do a lot of stuff that's not always clearly the right thing to do, the most efficient use of money, the most efficient use of capital, or doesn't have that short-term return like you talked about. And it's happening in China because China's got a different socioeconomic structure and political economy structure. And so I guess the philosophical question that I would pose to you and maybe to the readers is it even possible to replicate that in a economy that is much more structured towards the needs of capital owners, and that is it, if you accept that perhaps we can do a fraction of that, but we can't quite do it the way China does it because China is special and China is China, does it make you say that this must be the future then, and China's model is the model that we must rely on, and in fact we're just going to end up relying on them because we don't believe that we can or should replicate it here? If that's the model, if that's the question, is that a scary question? Is that a fatalistic question? I don't know, but I think that's the one that everyone should ask themselves.
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. And, thanks for posing here on Decouple. David, a pleasure. I understand you've got I'm not that early in the morning. You're very late at night there, and you've got a lot more work to do tonight. So enjoy the Red Bulls, and looking forward to staying in touch, my friend.
Likewise. Thanks, Chris, for having me, and it was a blast. Good time.
All right. Cheers.